There is a name that history almost forgot, not because he was unimportant, quite the opposite. He was perhaps the most consequential man in Germany in 1943, and the world never learned it. His name was Henning von Tresckow, and he stood at the exact center of a conspiracy that could have changed the course of the Second World War. He had the will, he had the plan, he had the means. He had the bomb in his hands, and when the moment came, the bomb did not go off. I want you to sit with that for a second. A bomb that did not go off. Not because it was discovered, not because someone talked, not because the Gestapo had broken the network, or some informant had sold out the men involved. It failed because of a malfunction so random, so absurdly mechanical, that it reads like something out of a novel, except it wasn't a novel. It was March 13th, 1943, and the Second World War had roughly 26 more months left to run. 26 months that would consume somewhere between 15 and 20 million additional lives, depending on whose count you accept. Lives that might have been saved if the temperature inside an aircraft hold had been a few degrees warmer on a winter night over the Eastern Front. This is the story of the man who came closest to stopping it. This is the story of what it cost him to keep trying after he failed, and what it ultimately cost him when the final attempt failed too. And this is a story about something that history rarely examines honestly. The specific, grinding, years-long courage required not to throw a bomb in a moment of passion, but to keep planning, keep recruiting, keep believing, and keep acting across month after month of failure, inside one of the most effective surveillance states ever constructed, while wearing the uniform of the very institution you were trying to destroy. Before I can tell you who Tresckow was, I need to tell you what Germany looked like from the inside in early 1943, because it looked nothing like the image that Nazi propaganda projected outward, and it looked nothing like the monolith of ideological commitment that post-war mythology sometimes suggests. By the spring of that year, the catastrophe at Stalingrad had just concluded. Field Marshal Friedrich Paulus had surrendered what remained of the 6th Army on February 2nd, roughly 90,000 men, the broken survivors of a force that had once numbered over 300,000. The frozen dead were still being catalogued in the ruins of a Soviet city that the Wehrmacht had spent months trying to consume and had instead been consumed by. The wounded were flooding hospitals across the Reich. Families were receiving letters, or not receiving them, which was always worse, silence as its own form of notification. The propaganda ministry had tried to manage the narrative. Goebbels announced a period of national mourning and declared that Stalingrad represented the heroic sacrifice of an army that had held firm so that the rest of Europe could be saved from Bolshevism. It was a performance of considerable craft, and a significant portion of the German population accepted it, at least on the surface, because the alternative, accepting that the regime had sent 300,000 men into a trap through strategic incompetence and refused to authorize a retreat until escape was impossible, was psychologically untenable for people who had invested so much in the idea that the Führer was infallible. But inside the officer corps of the Wehrmacht, things looked different. The professional soldiers, the men who had spent their careers studying military history, who understood force ratios and logistics, and the brutal arithmetic of modern warfare, many of them had known for months before Stalingrad that the 6th Army was doomed. They had watched Hitler override Zeitzler, override Paulus, override every professional military assessment that recommended withdrawal, and they had watched 300,000 men die because one man, with no formal military training and an absolute refusal to accept the concept of tactical retreat, had decided that Stalingrad would be held, and many of them had concluded, with the quiet certainty of professionals who have seen the data and followed the logic, that Germany could not win this war. Not anymore. Perhaps never, given the strategic situation that Hitler's own decisions had created. Henning von Tresckow was one of those men, and he was one of the first to reach that conclusion and one of the first to decide that the conclusion required action. He was 42 years old in 1943. He came from a Prussian military family, the kind of background that in Germany in the early 20th century meant a childhood saturated with military history, a sense of service as a vocation rather than a career, and a set of values that placed institutional duty and personal honor above comfort, safety, or He had served in the First World War as a teenager, had left the army briefly in the 1920s, had worked in banking, and had traveled, and had returned to military service in 1926 with a perspective that was broader than most of his colleagues. He was widely read. He spoke several languages. He thought carefully about politics and history in a way that the purely professional soldier often doesn't, and by the mid-1930s, when the nature of the Nazi regime was becoming impossible to misread, he had formed clear views about what Germany was becoming and what it would cost. He had not been a resistor from the beginning. Very few were, in the pure sense, and it is worth being honest about that. Like many officers of his generation and class, he had initially watched the Nazi consolidation of power with a mixture of concern and compartmentalization. The regime was remilitarizing Germany and restoring the prestige of the army, and those were things that professional soldiers had wanted. The political extremism could perhaps be managed. The anti-Semitism was distasteful but not yet understood in its full genocidal implication. These were the calculations that a great many decent, intelligent Germans made in the mid-1930s, and it is worth recording them honestly, rather than pretending that the later resistors were clear-eyed from the beginning about where everything was heading. What changed Tresckow, and changed him completely, was the Eastern Front. He arrived in the Soviet Union in 1941 as part of the staff of Army Group Center, and what he witnessed there was not the war that had been fought in France in 1940. The clean, rapid, professional campaign that had dazzled the world and that the Wehrmacht soldiers had experienced as a kind of proof that modern warfare could be conducted with speed and limited brutality. What he witnessed in Russia was something qualitatively different. He saw the Einsatzgruppen operating behind the lines, the mobile killing units that followed the army eastward and murdered Jews, Soviet commissars, and anyone else designated as a threat to the racial order that the regime was trying to establish in the occupied East. He saw the orders that came down through the command structure, directives that stripped away the legal protections of the Geneva Convention from Soviet prisoners of war, that authorized the shooting of civilians on the flimsiest of pretexts, that treated the occupied Soviet population not as people to be administered but as a subhuman mass to be exploited and, when inconvenient, eliminated. He saw, in short, that the Wehrmacht was not simply fighting a war. It was participating in a crime of historic dimensions, and the crime was being committed in the name of Germany, wearing German uniforms under German command authority. Tresckow reached a conclusion that very few officers in his position were willing to reach, because it was a conclusion that carried a cost. The institution he had served, the institution that defined his identity and his sense of purpose, had been corrupted at its foundations, not by external pressure but from within, by the voluntary collaboration of its own leadership with a criminal political authority. And the only way to stop it, the only way to restore any possibility of Germany emerging from this war, was something salvageable. Some fragment of moral standing that might eventually allow reconstruction, was to remove the man at the top, not transfer him, not negotiate with him. Remove EMA. This was not a decision made in a moment of passion. Tresckow was not a passionate man in the conventional sense. He was precise, controlled, analytical. He understood that killing Hitler was not simply a matter of personal bravery. Any fool could point a gun at a man if he got close enough. What it required was access, which was tightly controlled and difficult to obtain. It required timing, because an assassination without a plan for what followed was just a murder that would make no difference. It required a network of people in the right positions who could move, immediately after the act to seize control of the government, communicate with the Allies, and present the world with a Germany that had demonstrably rejected Nazism from within. And it required the ability to maintain all of this. The planning, the recruiting, the coordination, inside the most heavily surveilled political environment in modern European history, without being discovered, while continuing to perform your assigned military duties with sufficient competence that no one had reason to look more closely at what you were actually doing. Tresckow began building the conspiracy with the same methodical patience that he brought to any operational problem. He was serving as First Operations Officer of Army Group Center, a position that gave him access to senior officers and to information about Hitler's movements, access that was operationally essential and that he used with care. He recruited from his own immediate circle first, the men he knew well enough to trust with his life, because that was precisely what he was asking them to risk. His aide-de-camp, Fabian von Schlabrendorf, became one of his closest collaborators and eventually his primary operational partner. He made contact carefully and through intermediaries. With the broader resistance network that had been forming fitfully inside Germany since the mid-1930s, a loose, uncoordinated collection of politicians, diplomats, lawyers, church leaders, and former civil servants who had all reached similar conclusions about the regime and who were all waiting, in various degrees of desperation, for the moment when someone with the practical means to act would actually act. That was the central frustration of the German resistance throughout the war. Not a shortage of people who understood that Hitler had to go, but a surplus of people who understood it in the abstract while finding reasons not to act in the concrete. There were generals who had more access to Hitler than Tresckow, and who refused to use it. There were officers who were persuaded, seemed committed, and then withdrew when the moment approached. There were endless debates about legality. The question of whether it was permissible under the German military oath to kill the head of state, a question that Tresckow regarded as a luxury the situation did not permit. A.U. said Stossai in the conversations that his collaborators later recalled that if no one among the German officer class was willing to act, then Germany would pay for it before the judgment of history. Not just Hitler, not just the regime, but Germany, the country, the culture, the whole inheritance that was being spent like cash in a burning building. He was thinking about the verdict of posterity in a way that is remarkable given the pressure he was under. Most men in his position would have been focused on survival, on day-to-day calculation of risk and benefit, on the question of whether the next action was more likely to get them killed or to succeed. Tresckow was thinking about what the historical record would say. Not about him personally. He was genuinely indifferent to personal recognition, but about Germany, about whether there would be evidence somewhere in the archive of events that Germans had tried. At the end of 1942 and the beginning of 1943, Tresckow had a plan. Hitler was scheduled to visit Army Group Center's headquarters at Smolensk in mid-March, and the visit offered the kind of operational opportunity that the conspiracy had been waiting for. Hitler was notoriously difficult to get close to in the physical sense. His security arrangements, managed by the SS and shaped by his own deep paranoia, made spontaneous proximity impossible. He varied his routes, changed his schedules, kept even his closest associates uncertain about his movements until the last possible moment. But he traveled by aircraft, and the aircraft was a vulnerability. If a bomb could be placed on the plane before departure, it would detonate somewhere over the Eastern Front, and the explosion could plausibly be attributed to Soviet action. A lucky anti-aircraft hit, a sabotage operation that intelligence hadn't detected. There would be no trial, no public spectacle, no martyrdom narrative. Hitler would simply be dead, and the conspirators in Berlin, who had prepared their seizure of the government's key institutions with considerable care, would move. Tresckow and Schlabrendorf obtained a British-manufactured plastic explosive through resistance contacts who had connections to British intelligence via neutral intermediaries in Stockholm and Lisbon. The material was reliable, compact, and far more stable than German military explosives of the period. It could be handled without triggering, required a specific initiating mechanism, and crucially, could be shaped into almost any form. They shaped it to resemble 2 bottles of Cointreau, a French liqueur, the kind of thing that circulated among officers as gifts, entirely unremarkable in the context of a military headquarters where the social rituals of the officer class continued even in the middle of a catastrophic war. The fuse was a British-made pencil detonator, a chemical device activated by breaking a glass capsule inside the tube that allowed acid to eat through a wire and release the striker. The time delay depended on temperature. At room temperature, somewhere around 10 to 30 minutes. The device was small enough to fit in a coat pocket and looked, to any casual inspection, like a package of bottles. On March 13, 1943, Hitler arrived at Tresckow, activated the fuse and gave the package to a staff officer named Heinz Brandt, telling him it was a gift of brandy for someone at Führer headquarters in Rastenburg. Could Brandt carry it on the plane? Brandt, who had no idea what he was being asked to transport, agreed without hesitation. The package was loaded, the plane took off, and nothing happened. Nothing happened for the entire flight. Nothing happened when the plane landed at Hitler disembarked, went inside, continued his day. The bomb that was supposed to have killed him somewhere over the Minsk-Smolensk corridor was sitting inert in a bag at Führer headquarters, waiting to be collected by Brandt and passed to its intended recipient, who did not exist. The fuse had frozen. The cargo hold of the aircraft was unpressurized and unheated, and the temperature had dropped far below the threshold at which the acid in the pencil detonator could function. The mechanism had been activated correctly. The glass capsule had been broken. The acid had been released, but the cold had slowed the chemical reaction to the point where the acid could not eat through the wire before the plane landed, a matter of a few degrees of temperature. On a slightly warmer day, or in a pressurized aircraft, or if the package had been stored somewhere inside the passenger compartment rather than in the cargo hold. Adolf Hitler would have died on March 13, 1943, and the history of the next 2 years would have been different in ways that are impossible to calculate, but almost certainly would have involved fewer dead. Tresckow received word of the failure through a coded communication, and responded with the self-control that was perhaps his most defining characteristic. No visible reaction, no change in behavior that could be noticed by the wrong person. The immediate problem was retrieval. The package was sitting at Rastenburg, and if anyone opened it or examined it, they would find a block of plastic explosive and a British detonator, which would be followed immediately by the unraveling of everything. Schlabrendorf flew to Rastenburg the following day on a fabricated errand, retrieved the bottles under the pretext that the wrong package had been sent, and disassembled the device in a compartment of the overnight train back to some. He found exactly what Tresckow had suspected. The fuse had been properly activated. The mechanism had functioned, but the temperature had prevented completion. Nothing had failed through negligence or error. The code had simply won. I want to be precise about what it meant to do what Tresckow did in the days and weeks that followed. He did not give up. He did not retreat into the kind of philosophical resignation that the repeated failure of such attempts might reasonably produce, the sense that fate was intervening, that the attempt was somehow not meant to succeed, that perhaps the judgment of history he so often invoked would come through other means. He was not that kind of man, and he did not think in those terms. What he did, with a methodical practicality that defined him, was rebuild. He looked at what had failed, identified the specific technical problem, and began constructing the next approach. Within days, there was another attempt. A different officer, Rudolf Christoph von Goethe, was tasked with what amounted to a suicide mission. He would arm himself with explosives hidden in his overcoat and position himself next to Hitler during a visit to a Berlin exhibition of captured Soviet equipment on March 21, 1943, armed the fuses, and waited. Hitler walked through the exhibition faster than anticipated. His visits were typically brief, characteristically unpredictable, and left before Christoph could position himself with any reliability. Christoph had to disarm himself in a men's room, sweating through the process of deactivating fuses that had already been initiated, managing the risk of detonation with the same cold focus that the entire enterprise required. The attempt failed without anyone outside the conspiracy knowing it had been made. The pattern that emerged across these months, and the months that followed, is almost unbearable to trace in retrospect. Every attempt fails by the narrowest margin: a frozen fuse, a visit cut short, a changed schedule, a meeting cancellation that moved Hitler out of the room where he was supposed to be, a technical malfunction, a coincidence so minor that in any other context it would not merit mention. And yet each one of these minor coincidences bought Hitler more time, and more time meant more dead. More men on the Eastern Front, more prisoners dying in the camps, more cities being reduced to rubble across Europe, more of the accumulated civilization of a continent being consumed in the furnace that one man's refusal to accept the reality of his military situation had become. Tresckow understood this accounting. He kept it in his mind with a clarity that his colleagues sometimes found disquieting. The sense that every day that passed without action was a day whose cost could be measured in and that the philosophical comfort of waiting for better conditions was itself a moral choice, one that he refused to make. He pushed continuously. He maintained contact with the conspiracy's nodes in Berlin, men like Karl Gordler, the former mayor of Leipzig, who had been working to build a post-Hitler government structure for years, Ludwig Beck, the former chief of the General Staff who had resigned in protest over Hitler's war planning in 1938 and who was intended to serve as head of state after the coup. Hans Oster, the deputy chief of the Abwehr military intelligence service who had been passing information to Allied intelligence for years and who served as a critical coordination point for the entire resistance network. These were serious men, and they had done serious work. By 1943, the conspiracy had a plan for what happened after Hitler died that went well beyond improvisation. There were lists of ministers for a transitional government. There were drafts of armistice terms that could be offered to the Western Allies, based on assessments of what Britain and the United States would accept from a Germany that had demonstrably overthrown the Nazi regime from within. There were arrangements for the military districts across Germany, for which officers would move on, which installations, for how the SS would be neutralized, for how the public would be told what had happened. The plan was called Operation Valkyrie, and it was sophisticated enough that it had been incorporated into the official emergency planning structure, a fact that reflected either extraordinary nerve or extraordinary cynicism, depending on how you looked at it. The problem was always the same problem. They needed Hitler dead first, and Hitler refused to cooperate with his own assassination. As 1943 continued, the conspiracy's access problem became more acute. After Stalingrad, Hitler's travel patterns became more restricted and his security arrangements more elaborate. The early part of the war had seen him making relatively frequent visits to field headquarters, where the access was imperfect enough that a determined man with the right position could potentially get close. After Stalingrad, those visits became rarer, shorter, more tightly controlled. The window that the Smolensk visit had represented a senior officer able to place a package on the Führer S aircraft was not easily replicated. Into this situation came Claus von Stauffenberg, and his arrival changed the conspiracy in ways that would ultimately lead to both its most dramatic moment and its catastrophic failure. Stauffenberg was 35 years old in 1943, a decade younger than Tresckow, and his biography read like a deliberate contrast. Where Tresckow was the patient planner, the methodical builder who had been constructing this network for years, Stauffenberg was the man of action, charismatic, intense, marked by the war in the most literal way. He had lost his right hand, 2 fingers of his left hand, and his left eye to Allied aircraft fire in Tunisia in April 1943. He had recovered with a speed and completeness that his doctors found remarkable, and he had returned to Germany not diminished by what had happened to him, but radicalized. The physical destruction of his body had resolved whatever uncertainty remained in him about the necessity and urgency of action. He and Tresckow met and recognized each other immediately as men who had reached the same conclusions by different routes. Tresckow had the network, the planning, the institutional connections built over years. Stauffenberg had something that the conspiracy had lacked: access. In July 1944, he was appointed Chief of Staff to the Commander of the Reserve Army, a position that required him to attend Hitler's briefings at the Wolf's Lair in East Prussia. He would carry the bomb himself. The plan that Stauffenberg and Tresckow refined together over the spring and early summer of 1944 was, in its essentials, the plan that had been developing for years. Stauffenberg would place a bomb in the briefing room. The explosion would kill Hitler. Stauffenberg would fly back to Berlin immediately, where he would coordinate the coup with Beck and the other conspirators, who were positioned to move on government buildings, communications centers, and SS installations. Tresckow, who was by this time serving on the Eastern Front with Army Group Center again, would coordinate the military's response from that end. There was one modification to the plan that deserves particular attention, because it tells you something essential about the moral framework within which both Tresckow and Stauffenberg were operating. They had concluded, by the summer of 1944, that the coup should proceed even if the assassination failed. Even if Hitler survived the bomb, or if the bomb couldn't be placed at all, the political dimension of the operation should still be executed. The conspirators should still attempt to seize control of the government, still announce to Germany and the world that a group of Germans had tried to overthrow the Nazi regime. They would probably be captured and killed in relatively short order if Hitler was alive, but the attempt would be on the historical record. The world would know that this had happened. Germany would know that this had happened, and Tresckow believed with a conviction that seems to have never wavered, even at the end, that this knowledge mattered, that it was worth dying for, not because it would succeed, but because it would be true. On July 20th, 1944, Stauffenberg arrived at the Wolf's Lair, carrying a briefcase with a bomb inside it. He had managed to arm only one of the 2 explosive charges he had brought. He was interrupted during the arming process, and had to proceed with half the planned explosive weight. He placed the briefcase under the conference table, as close as he could get it to Hitler's position. He left the room on a pretext. The bomb detonated at 12:42 in the afternoon. The blast killed 4 people and wounded many others. It did not kill Hitler. Another officer, at some point during the briefing, had moved the briefcase to the other side of the thick wooden leg of the conference table. A minor, thoughtless repositioning that put approximately 18 inches of dense wood and conference table construction between the explosive and the man it was designed to kill. The damage to Hitler was significant burst-ear, temporary paralysis in his right arm, minor burns, but he was alive. He was on the phone with Mussolini less than 2 hours later. The coup collapsed almost immediately. The conspirators in Berlin had begun executing the plan, seizing the Wehrmacht headquarters complex, sending arrest orders for SS commanders. But when it became clear that Hitler had survived, the network fell apart with a speed that was itself a kind of verdict on the limits of what the conspiracy had been able to build. Officers who had been part of the plan, or who had been recruited to execute it, simply stopped obeying orders from the conspirators and reverted to the authority of the surviving Führer. Stauffenberg was arrested at the Bendler block, brought to the courtyard, and shot by firing squad in the early hours of July 21st, along with several other senior conspirators. The regime's response to what followed was systematic and savage. The Gestapo and the SS ran down the network with the comprehensive investigative capability of a state that had been perfecting the mechanics of repression for over a decade. Thousands of people were arrested. The People's Court, under the fanatical Roland conducted show trials designed to humiliate as much as punish. The accused were denied belts and suspenders so that they had to hold their pants up while being screamed at, ensuring that the visual record of these final confrontations showed the defendants as degraded and pathetic rather than dignified. Nearly 5,000 people were executed in the months that followed July 20th, 1944. Many of them in the prolonged and deliberately brutal manner that Hitler specifically requested, hung on meat hooks with piano wire. The deaths filmed for his personal viewing. Tresckow learned of the failure on the Eastern Front on the evening of July 20th. He had known for some time that the net was tightening. Too many threads of the conspiracy led back to him, and the Gestapo's investigation of previous attempts had been gradually approaching the core network. He spent the evening with Schlabber, the same man who had sat next to him on that train in March 1943, disassembling the frozen bomb with careful hands. He talked about what had happened, what it meant, what he believed. He was composed. His collaborators who survived later described a man who was sad but not shattered, who spoke with the clarity of someone who had long since made his essential decisions and was now simply following the logic of those decisions to their conclusion. He said that he did not believe the assassination attempt had failed in any meaningful sense. He said that the world would eventually understand what had been attempted and would judge it accordingly. He said that the German resistance had existed and had acted, and that this fact, the bare fact of it, independent of whether it succeeded, was itself a contribution to the historical record that Germany needed. And then he said that in the morning he would be dead, and that this was the right outcome, because the alternative, capture, interrogation, the specific theatrical degradation that the regime inflicted on its enemies, was not something he was willing to submit to, not out of cowardice about physical suffering, but because he refused to give the regime the performance it wanted. He would not be the man on the meat hook. He would not be the film that Hitler watched in the evening. On the morning of July 21st, 1944, Tresckow walked out to the front lines near Ostrow in Poland. He fired his service pistol several times to simulate a firefight, and then he detonated a hand grenade. He was 43 years old. His body was initially given a military funeral with the honors due his rank, because at the moment of his death, his involvement in the conspiracy had not yet been confirmed. Within weeks, the Gestapo had established his central role. His body was exhumed. Any honors were revoked. He was cremated, and his ashes were scattered without ceremony, in the manner of the regime's treatment of those it had designated as traitors. I have spent considerable time thinking about what Tresckow represents, and I keep returning to a distinction that I think matters enormously in that military and political history tends to undervalue. There is battlefield courage, the courage of the moment, operating under adrenaline, surrounded by men facing the same danger, where the options are narrow and the action is immediate. That is a real and admirable thing, and the men who possess it deserve recognition. But what Tresckow demonstrated was something categorically different. It was the courage of sustained purpose, the ability to hold to a decision over years, through repeated failure, through the exhaustion of constant concealment, through the loss of colleagues, through the progressive narrowing of options, through the accumulating evidence that the enterprise might simply be impossible, while maintaining, on the surface, the behavior of a loyal Wehrmacht officer, while continuing to do his actual job well enough that nothing drew unwanted scrutiny, while living every day with the knowledge that discovery meant not just his own death, but the death of everyone he had recruited, everyone he had involved, everyone who had trusted his judgment that this could be done. That kind of sustained, rational, cold-eyed persistence in the face of continuous failure is rare. It requires not just courage, but a particular relationship to uncertainty, the ability to keep acting on a purpose even when the outcome cannot be predicted, even when the evidence suggests that the purpose may be unachievable, because the alternative to acting is simply accepting the ongoing cost of inaction. Tresckow had made his calculation clearly, and had never recalculated it. Every month of delay was a month paid for in lives, and no argument about timing or legality or the optimal moment was worth the price of those lives. This was his conviction, and it held through 4 years of war and multiple failures. Right up to the morning he walked out to the front lines with a grenade in his hand. The war did not end in 1943. It ended in May 1945, in the Rubel of Berlin, after the Soviet army had fought through the city street by street and Hitler had died by his own hand in a bunker 50 feet below the ruins. Between the moment that frozen bombs sat inert in the cargo hold of Hitler's aircraft in March 1943 and that final collapse came somewhere between 15 and 20 million additional deaths. The counts vary by source and methodology, and the exact number is unknowable, but no serious historical estimate puts it below 10 million. That is the weight of the frozen fuse. That is what a few degrees of temperature bought. A frozen fuse, a shortened exhibition visit, a briefcase moved 18 inches by an officer who had no idea what he was doing. The thickness of a conference table leg. These are the pivots on which the final years of the deadliest conflict in human history turned. And I am telling you about them not to produce despair. Tresckow would have had no patience for despair, but because I think there is something important in understanding that history is not predetermined. It does not move toward fixed outcomes through the inevitable operation of large forces. It is contingent. It is subject to accident. It can be changed, and it almost was changed, multiple times, by men who looked at what was happening and decided they could not simply watch. The world that emerged from the Second World War remembered the bomb in the briefcase, the dramatic last attempt, the firing squad in the courtyard. It has the shape of a story, and stories are what get remembered. Tresckow did not have that shape. He was the builder, the patient one, the man who had been at this longer than anyone, who had absorbed failure after failure without breaking, who had maintained the conviction in the network when everyone else had reasons to wait. History tends to forget the patient ones, because patience doesn't make for a clean narrative line, but the patient ones are frequently the ones who make the whole thing possible. Without Tresckow, there is no... Without the years of building and recruiting and planning and failing and rebuilding, there is no July 20th, 1944. There is no historical record of an attempt. There is no evidence anywhere in the archive that Germans tried. Tresckow gave Germany that evidence. He gave it at the cost of everything. And if you have learned his name today for the first time, I would ask you to hold it, because it belongs to the category of names that matter, not because they changed the outcome, but because they changed what was possible to believe about the humans involved. The attempt matters. It always has. He knew that, and he acted on it every day for 4 years, until the morning he could act no more. What the historical record also shows, and what is rarely given sufficient weight, is the institutional loneliness of what Tresckow was doing. He was not operating within a tradition of resistance. There was no manual, no precedent, no body of experience to draw on for the specific challenge of building a conspiracy inside a modern totalitarian military state. The German resistance invented its own methods as it went, learning from each failure, adapting to each new security measure the regime put in place, working around each informant who compromised a node of the network. The Gestapo was not an abstract threat. It was an institution with enormous resources, a culture of institutional paranoia, and the full coercive power of the state behind it. It had already destroyed several earlier iterations of organized resistance in Germany. It would ultimately destroy this one too. But it took until July 1944, which means that Tresckow and the network he built maintained operational security inside the most state in modern European history for the better part of 4 years. That is, by any measure, an extraordinary achievement, even in failure. The cost of that achievement was paid in ways that are easy to abstract and hard to make concrete. Tresckow recruited men into a conspiracy that he knew would probably kill them. He did it with full transparency. He did not deceive the men he brought in about the risks. He was explicit. This would likely end in their deaths, whether the attempt succeeded or failed. The German state did not distinguish between successful and unsuccessful treason. If they were discovered, they would be killed, and their families would suffer. And everything they had built over their lives would be used against them in the most degrading public manner the regime could devise. He asked men to accept this, and many did, because his clarity about the stakes and his evident willingness to accept the same consequences himself made refusal feel like something a man would have to live with. Schlabrendorf, who survived, who was arrested after July 20th, tortured by the Gestapo, tried before the People's Court, and miraculously survived when Roland, the fanatical judge who had presided over the show trials, was killed by an Allied bomb that hit the courtroom during an air raid on February 3, 1945. Literally in the middle of the proceedings, Schlabrendorf spent the rest of his life bearing witness to what Tresckow had built and what it had cost. He became a judge on the West German Federal Constitutional Court after the war, a fact that strikes me as having a particular justice to it. The man who had disassembled the frozen bomb on a train in 1943, who had sat with Tresckow on the last evening of his life, who had survived the Gestapo and the People's Court and the collapsing Reich, went on to help build the constitutional structure of a Germany that Tresckow had died trying to make possible. The family members of the conspirators paid the price that Tresckow had warned about. The regime had a policy, Sippenhaft kin liability, under which the families of traitors could be arrested, stripped of assets, and imprisoned. Tresckow's wife, Erika, was arrested. His children were taken. The family estate was seized. This was the personal arithmetic of what he had chosen, and he had chosen it with full knowledge, because he had concluded that the alternative, doing nothing, continuing to serve a criminal regime, watching the war consume millions of additional lives while waiting for a better moment that might never come, was worse. I want to be careful here not to make Tresckow into a saint, because he was not. And sanctification is a form of distance that makes the lesson harder to receive. He was a man shaped by the institutions and assumptions of his class and his time, with all the limitations that implies. He had served the Wehrmacht loyally 4 years before reaching his conclusions about what the institution had become. He had participated in the sense of wearing the uniform and performing the duties in a war of aggression that killed millions. The road to his resistance was long, and there are legitimate questions about whether it should have been shorter. These questions are worth asking, honestly, because they are the questions that apply not to historical figures, but to people making decisions in real time. To you, to me, to anyone trying to figure out at what point complicity becomes unacceptable and action becomes necessary. Tresckow reached that point, made his decision, and held to it at every cost. The fact that the road to the decision was long does not diminish the decision itself. It makes it more human, and therefore more instructive. The July 20th, 1944 conspiracy was not just about killing Hitler. It was also, and this was perhaps its deepest purpose, the purpose that Tresckow had articulated most clearly. It was about Germany's relationship to its own history. The men who attempted the assassination knew, by the summer of 1944, that Germany was going to lose the war. The Western Allies had landed in France in June. The Soviet army was advancing from the east with a momentum that could not be stopped. The question was no longer whether Germany would be defeated, but under what conditions and at what additional cost. A negotiated end, mediated by a German government that had overthrown the Nazi regime from within, would have meant different terms than an unconditional surrender by a Nazi state. It might have meant a less catastrophic final year. It might have preserved more of the physical and social fabric of Germany itself. These were the practical arguments. But Tresckow's deeper argument was not practical. It was moral. He believed that Germany needed, for its own sake, a record of having tried, not because that record would save anything in the immediate term. He knew it probably wouldn't, but because, without it, the entire German experience of the Nazi period would be a story about collaboration and acquiescence, with no chapter in which anyone had said no. That story, that narrative of unanimous complicity, was false, and its falsehood mattered, because false histories produce false conclusions. And the conclusion that all Germans had been Nazis or had been willing instruments of Nazism was a conclusion that would shape Germany's relationship to itself and to the world for generations. He was right about that. The attempt did become part of the record. The memory of the resistance did become part of how Germany reconstructed its sense of national identity after 1945. It was insufficient. It was always insufficient against the scale of what the regime had done, but it was true, and it was there, because Tresckow and the men he recruited had put it there. History did not end in 1943 when it might have. It kept going, at enormous cost, to its appointed conclusion in the ruins of Berlin in the spring of 1945. But the cost of that continuation was paid in the specific currency of human lives, and the men who tried to stop it, who tried again and again across years, with the tools they had, knowing the odds against them, deserved to be known. Not celebrated in the way that obscures what actually happened, not mythologized in the way that turns complicated men into smooth heroes. Known, understood, reckoned with honestly. Tresckow's last words, as Schlabrendorf remembered them, were about duty and about history. He said that he had done what he believed he was required to do, and that if he had not done it, he would have been unable to face the judgment of his own conscience. He said that conscience was not a luxury that a man in his position could afford to silence, even when acting on it was the most dangerous thing he could do. And then he went out into the morning, and he did not come back. That is the story. A man who could have stopped the war, and almost did, and kept trying after he failed, and died trying. The war did not end in 1943. But the attempt was made. The record exists, and the patient ones, the builders, the men who held the purpose through the years of failure, they are the ones who put it there.